heard a colleague talking about it is critical to know our history. And I have some screenshots here from the Democratic Party's history that says our history, and I'd ask you now to submit that for the record. And it's interesting, and also this Wall Street Journal article, The Democrats' Missing History, it documents a number of things. I'd ask you now to consider on both those, so thank you, Mr. Chair. There's no reference in the history of the Democratic Party platform supporting slavery. There were 6 of those from 1840 to 1860. No reference to Democratic presidents who owned slaves. There were 7 from 1800 to 1861. There's no reference to the number of Democratic platforms that either supported segregation outright or were silent on the subject. There were 20 from 1868 to 1948. No reference to Jim Crow laws, nor is there reference to the role the Democrats played in creating them. These were the post-Civil War laws passed enthusiastically by Democrats in that pesky 50-year part of the DNC's missing years. Also, there's no reference that 3/4 of the opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act what came in the House from Democrats, or that 80% of the nay votes in the Senate came from Democrats. There's certainly no reference to the fact that the opposition included future Democratic Senate leader Robert Byrd from West Virginia, former Klan member, Tennessee Senator Al Gore Sr., father of Vice President Al Gore. And last but certainly not least, there's no reference to the fact that Birmingham, Alabama Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor, who infamously unleashed dogs and fire hoses on civil rights protesters, was in fact a member of both the Democratic National Committee and the Ku Klux Klan. So it is important that we know our history and we not punish people today for the sins of their predecessors in the Democratic Party. But I just stated all facts, and again, we have people who are denying history. That's not helpful to our discussion. But Mr. Owens, I would ask you, understanding that today's claim that the Republicans are the party of racism, what do you think your great-grandfather Silas would have said to someone who claims the Republicans are the party of racism?
Well, my great-great-grandfather lived through that period, and he wouldn't have said that because at that time, all blacks were Republicans because that was the party that gave them the freedom.
Let me just ask you, have you suffered for taking these conservative positions?
What I guess what it comes down to is I don't think I've suffered at all. I'm thankful to growing up in an age where I was the fourth black American to be given a scholarship at the University of Miami. I was one of the first blacks to integrate this school. So I understand and understood exactly what racism looked like and how it felt. But my mom said one thing, remember specifically as I was kind of going through this phase, says, Burgess, make sure you don't let somebody else's problem become yours. In other words, Burgess, don't let a racist let you become one. The other thing is that my dad taught us, very simply, to be a leader. If it's right, do it. If it's wrong, don't. I love my country. I love my race. I love my family. And that becomes all the other stuff of being accepted or liked. It makes no difference to me. We're at a very, very important part of our country today where black Americans are waking up. And I know that a lot might not agree with what I'm saying. That's okay. Just listen. And with time, let it simmer a little bit. Look around and see where our misery is being done today. Our misery is in the urban communities throughout our country where our kids have no hope, no jobs, no family, no dad, and no one tell them they can make it. If we understand that and we take responsibility, every single generation has done in our past to make sure the next generation feels better about their opportunities than less. We are failing them big time if we don't change our narrative. These kids can do it. We just have to believe in them, give them opportunities, and tell them to man up and woman up. It's okay if things get wrong. Things go sideways for every single person that lives, or God wouldn't be a fair God. When you go sideways, stand up, man up, woman up, and let's get back on the track and get after your dreams and get this thing done with.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. We
appreciate all of the panel.
Time is up for Mr. Gohmert, and we're going to move on. And first,
thank all of you for being here today.
Ranking Member McCaul, you're recognized.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, I have a very brief statement. I have a couple of questions. Just last week, Norwegian and Japanese oil tankers lawfully traversing the Gulf of Oman were attacked by Iran. We've all seen the evidence for ourselves. This was Iran's second attack on international shipping in weeks. Moreover, Iran attempted to shoot down a U.S. surveillance drone in the area. These attacks were no coincidence. Within days of the administration's announcement, they would no longer grant waivers for Iranian oil. Tehran responded with threats to protect and defend Iran's waterway as a retaliatory measure. This spring, Iran displayed propaganda on a billboard in downtown Tehran showing United States and Israeli ships being sunk in a battle. The billboard read in English, Farsi, Hebrew, and Arabic, "We drowned them all." Total propaganda, not to mention the fact they fired a rocket at our embassy in Iraq. Iran continues to flout UN Security Council ballistic missile sanctions. They continue to enable its network proxies to wreak havoc. In fact, the top general in Iran called for prepare for war to the proxies. Our general said the threat is imminent. A particular concern are the Houthi attacks on Saudi oil fields and airports. The threat Iran poses to the United States goes back to 1979 and the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and has continued with the deaths of 600 servicemen from 2003 to 2011, which Iran bears responsibility for. In May, the threat to U.S. personnel in Iraq was judged so significant that many of our diplomats were evacuated. A few days later, as I mentioned earlier, a rocket landed near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Iran's announcement that it will begin enriching and stockpiling uranium in violation of international commitments should concern everyone on the planet. All of these actions reveal desperation on the part of Iran. In my view, the sanctions are working. It is crippling Iran. It's crippling their economy. They are cash-starved, and Hezbollah now is begging for cash. To me, these are all positive signs. Their cries for attention are a call for action for the United States and our allies. I believe our maximum pressure campaign is working. We must continue to meet their aggression with forceful diplomacy. I believe all of us, the administration, Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, agree that peace is preferable to war. No one wants to see military action against Iran. But rest assured, the United States will be prepared to respond to any attacks against our security and security in the region.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I want to compliment Senator Shaheen for doing our homework on Syria, traveling, understanding the strategic implications of losing in Syria for the United States and our allies. In New Hampshire and South Carolina, not a lot of talk about Syria. It's not that people don't care, it's just we've got our plate full here at home with all of our needs in our own backyard. And the only thing I can tell people throughout the country, you ignore these problems at our own peril. The wave of refugees that came out of Syria when the civil war first began is going to replicate itself. Or I guess we can all sit on the sidelines and watch 3 million people be killed. I hope we don't do that. So Idlib is a province in northwestern Syria where the opposition is basically in a corner near the border of Turkey. Assad, with the help of Iran and mostly Russia, is trying to break their will and literally destroy them. Within this group of people of about 3.5 million, there's some really hardcore al-Qaeda types, al-Nusra, all kind of names associated with the groups, but they're radical Sunni Islamists, and they would bring ISIS back roaring. We don't want them to win the day, and we sure as heck don't want Iran to control Syria, and I think it would be a huge mistake for the United States to let Assad prevail in this war, and let me tell you why. It never ends with him. Every radical Sunni Islamist group in the world will use Assad's presence in Syria as a recruiting tool. He's a proxy of Iran. Without Iran, there would be no Assad. So you've created a great recruiting opportunity for radical Islam if you let Assad prevail. Our country, on multiple occasions, has said Assad must go. Why? Because he's a war criminal. He's lost all legitimacy. Russia will have basically trumped the United States, no pun intended, in the backyard of the Mideast, Syria. And President Trump, to his credit, changed his decision to withdraw all forces in northeastern Syria and have a holding force with more international involvement to prevent ISIS from coming back in the Manbij area, making sure Iran doesn't come down and take over with Assad that part of Syria, and that Turkey doesn't come into northeastern Syria to deal with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish elements of the YPG. A small American contingent force has brought some stability to northeastern Syria. Our Kurdish allies who stepped up to the plate feel like they're in a better spot. We have to realize that Turkey has a legitimate concern about the YPG elements, but to keep everybody apart and make sure ISIS doesn't come back. Nobody's talking about Idlib. President Trump, to his credit, did tweet on 2nd of June, just a few weeks ago, hearing word that Russia, Syria, and to a lesser extent, Iran, are bombing the hell out of Idlib province in Syria and indiscriminately killing many innocent civilians. The world is watching this butchery. What is the purpose? What will it get you? Stop. Good tweet. The only way it's going to stop is for Russia and Iran to pay a price for helping Assad. So it's Russian jets with Syrian jets that are indiscriminately bombing civilians in Idlib. If Idlib falls and these people flush out of Syria, you're going to have another wave of refugees coming to Turkey, which is saturated, and eventually Turkey is going to open up the floodgates back into Europe. And we're going to repeat this all over again. To my European friends and allies, you've been reluctant, except the French and the British, to help us in northeastern Syria with a holding force. How many times do you have to see the same movie to understand we need to do something differently? What do you tell European populations that we don't have the will to put a few thousand troops in Syria to make sure that we're not flooded in Europe with people fleeing for their lives? So it just never ceases to amaze me how quickly we forget the lessons of the past. As to Idlib, they've broken the agreement we had. Turkey, to their credit, has been trying to find a political solution in that part of Syria. And Senator Sheen and I both know the only way you end this war is through a political negotiation in Geneva. By having some American forces with our partners in northeastern Syria, we have leverage over the outcome. If we could stand Assad down in Idlib, we'd have more leverage to allow the Syrian people to heal their own country. So as these attacks escalate, and they will, the president and his team, in conjunction with the civilized world, needs to come up with an Idlib plan. Now, what I want to do with Senator Sheen is come up with some sanctions or some policies directed at the impending disaster called Idlib. I want us to put on the record our objection to what Russia, Iran, and Assad's doing, and try to craft some consequences and actually work with the administration to stop what will be inevitable if we don't send the right signal, which will be the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, a new wave of refugees, and putting radical Sunni Islam on steroids, because they'll come to the fight if you don't. So here's your choice to the free world. If you don't get involved in Syria and try to end this madness, radical Sunni Islam will gladly take your place. And that's not a good outcome. There is no winning in that situation. If Assad wins, we lose. If the radical Sunni Islamist al-Nusra types win, we lose. The good news is the best way to win is to help the Syrian people. The Syrian people don't want to be dictated anymore by Assad. That's how this all started. They're tired of living under his control. And they're not radical people by nature. They're not turning to ISIS as the answer to Assad. Give them a choice. It's in our interest to be involved to some extent. We're not the world's policemen, but we are the glue that holds the world together. And Syria can only be put back together through peace negotiations where the parties have some leverage over their adversaries. It's not just a humanitarian crisis in the making. This is going to change the balance in the power in Syria and the Mideast in a very bad way. You're going to have a never-ending conflict between Iranian proxies and radical Sunni Islamic groups in Syria unless you defang both. And doing nothing sounds good on paper until you realize what happens when you ignore a problem. End on this. On September the 10th, 2001, America did not have one soldier in Afghanistan, not one dime of aid to Afghanistan. We didn't even have an ambassador to Afghanistan. We just watched as the Taliban took over, put women in soccer stadiums and killed them for sport because they wore the burqa too short. They blow up statues of the Buddha, and we were under the illusion, well, that's their problem, not ours. Well, it eventually became our problem because the people doing this stuff to women and religious artifacts of other cultures are compelled by God to deal with us. If you think leaving them alone ends this conflict, you don't understand what the conflict's about. They're driven by a religious ideology that has no place for anybody in this room. Our friends in Israel are moderate Muslims. So you either deal with them now or you deal with them later. Assad is in a different category, but just as evil, same kind of butchery. And I am here to tell you, to Europe, you better up your game when it comes to Idlib, because you're going to pay a heavy price. To the Trump administration, I really appreciate what you've done in northeastern Syria. I appreciate the tweet of the president on June 2nd, but we got to do more than tweet. And we in the Senate need to offer some assistance to the administration and our allies, and working with Senator Shaheen, we'll try to find a way to move forward. And I appreciate her interest. There's not a whole lot of upside to talking about things like this in modern American politics, but you're always going to be viewed well by history when you address a problem, when you stand up against evil, and when you try to do something about it. It may not be popular for the moment, but time will prove you right. Thank you, Senator Shaheen. With that, I yield.
The reality is that we have an unprecedented humanitarian and security crisis on our border.
60,000 children taken into custody at the border in the last 6 weeks alone.
We need to close these loopholes and get control of our border.
Around this country, including my state of Florida, and we're not on the border, they want border security.
I think this is truly a humanitarian crisis. I hope our friends on the other side, the Democrats, will step up and join us.
We really are calling on Democrats. Work with us. This is not a manufactured crisis. This is a problem we have to solve, and it's growing out of control.
The breaking point has long passed at the border. This is not sustainable. It's not fair to those who wear the uniform of the United States.
The security of our country and the well-being of tens of thousands of immigrants are at stake. And Democrats are refusing to address the situation because they don't like the president.
This situation is not sustainable for the United States, and this administration is committed to securing the border.
Our Democratic colleagues continue to pretend that there is not a problem.
Our Border Patrol agents are spending more time caring for these migrants than they are patrolling our border, which is their core function.
We've got to provide them relief. We've got to stop talking past everybody and recognize there's a humanitarian crisis, there's a public health crisis.
We have to surge resources to this area to end this crisis.
It is time for the Democrats to engage, to work with us. The time for action on immigration is now.
So I'm going to bring it up freestanding next week and see if they really aren't interested in dealing with this massive humanity that we have to take care of.
Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order. I apologize that we are slightly delayed. We had a series of votes on the Senate floor, but it is good now to convene the hearing. Let me begin by thanking all of you for attending and thanking Senator Hirono for working with me and my staff to convene this hearing and bring these witnesses together. The topic before us is one I believe of great importance: the need for term limits for members of Congress so that we can begin to fix what is broken here in Washington politics. Before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to explain why we've organized today's hearing. The 2016 election, the American people made a resounding call to drain the swamp that is modern Washington. And sadly, this is a bipartisan problem. The American people have lost confidence in Washington and especially in Congress. And it isn't hard to see why. Enmeshed in backroom deals and broken promises, our capital has too often become a political playground for the powerful and the well-connected, for members of the permanent political class looking to accumulate more and more power at the expense of American taxpayers. As part of his promise to drain the swamp, President Trump strongly endorsed and campaigned on passing congressional term limits. Though our founders didn't include term limits in the Constitution, they feared the creation of a permanent political class that existed parallel to rather than within American society. As Benjamin Franklin observed, quote, "In free governments, the rulers are the servants, and the people their superiors. For the former, therefore, to return among the latter was not to degrade, but to promote them." The fears of the framers have today been realized. Today, the swamp is hard at work picking winners and losers, with hardworking Americans typically winding up on the losing end. Every year, Congress spends billions of dollars on giveaways for the well-connected. Washington insiders get taxpayer money, members of Congress get reelected, and the system works for everyone except the American people. This kind of self-interest builds on itself as members spend more and more time in office. In an age in which the partisan divides seem intractable, it is remarkable that public support for congressional term limits remains strong across party lines. In poll after poll conducted over decades, Americans who are Republicans, who are Democrats, who are independents, Americans who are conservatives, who are liberals, who are moderates, who are men, who are women, who are Anglo-American, who are African-American, who are Hispanic, all support term limits by overwhelming margins. For example, a 2018 McLaughlin & Associates poll found that 82% of Americans support term limits for Congress, including 89% of Republicans, but also 76% of Democrats support term limits. 83% of independents support term limits. 72% of Hispanics support term limits. And 70% of African Americans support term limits. Indeed, the one group, it seems, in America that doesn't support term limits are career politicians here in Washington. Everybody else recognizes the problem. A 2016 Rasmussen poll showed much the same thing, as did a 2013 Gallup poll. These results have been consistent year after year after year. Ending that dynamic of Congress enriching insiders and using those insiders to hold on to powers favors neither party. It's not a problem of just Republicans or just Democrats. Restoring confidence and accountability in Congress shouldn't be the business of just one party or of just this committee or even of just the Senate. It concerns all Americans, whatever your politics. So why hasn't Congress acted already? It's straightforward. too many career politicians don't want to restrict their own power, and neither party wants to act on its own. Still, the American people recognize that congressional term limits would help fix the brokenness and corruption fostered by career politicians in Washington today. At our founding, representatives left their homes, their farms, their businesses. They traveled to Washington to represent their constituents. They served in Congress for a time, but usually returned to their homes and their affairs. Leaders like George Washington and John Adams and James Madison reached the height of political power and then relinquished it to return to public life, private life. But today, members of Congress aren't doing that. Instead, far too many of our politicians come to Washington to stay. Too much of Washington's business is dictated by career politicians, by bureaucrats, and by lobbyists who spend time as one or the other. The rise of political careerism in modern Washington is a sharp departure from what the founders intended in our federal governing bodies, to effectively drain the swamp and end the phenomenon of career politicians. It is long past time to enact term limits for Congress. I am the author of a constitutional amendment that would limit U.S. senators to 2 6-year terms and would limit members of the House of Representatives to 3 2-year terms. At this point, we currently have 14 co-sponsors in the Senate. It is my hope that this hearing today will help explain why we should come together, Republicans and Democrats across party lines, to enact term limits to protect the American people. The Senate, I believe, should take up and vote on the term limits amendment that I've introduced. And if Congress will simply listen to the American people, to the overwhelming majorities across party lines that want to see term limits, which we have for the president, see term limits also for Congress, then we can rest confidence that the states would quickly ratify that amendment. The only impediment is the United States Congress, and I hope that this hearing and the panel that we have to get to today, the two panels, will help move that discussion forward. With that, I recognize Senator Hirono for her opening statement.
I want to celebrate another legislative accomplishment the Senate notched last week. On Thursday, the Senate passed the Taxpayer First Act and sent it to President Trump's desk to become law. This legislation is the most thorough package of reforms to the Internal Revenue Service in 20 years. Let me say that again. The Senate just passed the most significant reforms to the IRS in 2 decades. It will create a new independent process for appeals to ensure taxpayers receive fair treatment. And during dispute resolution, taxpayers will now get access to the same information the IRS has. There will be more accountability within the IRS when it comes to cybersecurity, careful management of technology, and overall efficiency. There will be a new streamlined system for addressing identity theft. There will be better procedures for advance notification in the event of an audit or an asset seizure. And there will be new steps to make it easier to file your taxes and supporting documents online. So this is a significant accomplishment. These reforms will make one of the least appealing annual tasks for hardworking Americans a little bit less painful. A year and a half ago, the Republican members of this body joined with House Republicans and President Trump to deliver historic tax cuts and tax reform to the American people. Middle-class families, parents, small business owners, farmers, and job creators across the nation are keeping more of what they earn and sending less to the IRS. And now, thanks to this latest achievement, the IRS will be just a little bit easier to deal with as well.